Okay, so this is pretty much where we left off, but what I had to do was my scene crashed after part 2, so I actually had to redo a lot of the lights, so this will probably look a bit different from what we had before. So to recap, this is the plate, and we started adding in the lights that we could see from the footage, like so at the moment in this scene I've got about 6 lights. I raised the floor. I should have done that in part 2 really. I forgot why it was lower, but anyway, so that's been raised. I added in this box as well because I know in the plate there's a shed there as well. At the moment I would say this background area is getting a lot of light from our general area light. If I just quickly rotate around the scene, just in case this differs a fair amount from part 2, which it probably shouldn't. We've got the background light and these 2 spotlights, one light like a softbox at the side, and we also have a light hidden away in this room. Whoops, so I'll just try and show you that, but it's just angled slightly down. It's pretty soft, just to highlight the corner of the floor. So in the render it looks like this, and yeah, I'll just get up the plate. So yeah, we can see, as discussed, this lady's pretty dark, but when the actresses walk through, we can see a little bit of highlight, which is probably just spill from the green screen, but because it's there, it would be good to have a little bit of light in that room anyway, because anywhere that's green we're probably going to cut floor from here, so we need to have some sort of similar light to these actresses as a base. And then we've got the 2 spotlights from the top bit, this bit, and the main area light. I think in part 2 I showed the HDR where we could actually see what was being done on set, so we've just put them in. So the next step would be, from part 2 I did actually delete all the render layers that I've got, just so anyone that's watching or using this as a reference will have the same point that I have. So I've got these lights, and as I was creating them, so you saw me do this in part 2, but I was changing the AOV light group name to be relevant. I was renaming the lights, so I've got the sky dome, which is HDR, changed the light group, did the same for each of these. So my spotlight 1, spotlight 2, softbox 1, 2, 3 as well. So I've done that. That means if we decide to render separate, separate the lights, then we could do that. Now what I'm going to do is, whoops, not the hypershade, is go into my render settings, and I'm going to change the render passes or AOVs. So for the moment I don't care about most of these, so I'm going to just remove. The only ones I want are diffuse and specular. This is a recording from the future after this video was done. I just wanted to add in another little thing. Technically, to fully rebuild our shot in the most basic way, we would actually need the specular indirect as well. I thought we would get that in the specular, but later in the video you'll find out that we don't fully get that. So as I've said before, like in your master layer, you might not want to render all these light groups because you'll end up with about 42 passes in this example, but you want to turn on the specular indirect for the bounce lights, change the driver to EXR, and do I have all light groups turned on? Turn on all light groups, so you will end up with more. So I've got about 6 lights, and then it will render, so I'll get diffuse and then different diffuse passes for each light. Same for each of these, so combined they're each going to give me 7 different passes. So that's like 21, and imagine if you have that turned on for each of these render layers, so you're going to end up with like, I don't know, 70 different passes, and that might take quite a lot of time to rebuild in Nuke. As you'll find out later, when I when I do these breakdowns. So this is the specular and diffuse, but when you if you add in the specular indirect, which I'm advising for the bounce reflections, you'll avoid, you'll get more control. But later in the video, you'll find out we add the specular indirect on its own, but doing it this way, it's not controllable. So I would say for anyone that's trying to follow along with this video, add your specular indirect with the light groups turned on, and then just add another backdrop here, and do that on your master layer, because doing it for all these separate layers, we're going to end up with a serious amount of renders. So for each of these, you know, foreground, mid layer for the moment, at least, unless you need full control, you could probably turn on these light groups when you're doing final rendered tweaks. But if you just want to look at and control your scene completely, just have these on for the master layer, and then for each of these areas, you could probably just right click, do absolute override, and turn it off. Sorry, there we go. So for each render layer, why is that not adding? Whoops. Is that adding? Oh, okay. Sorry, I've just added it multiple times. So then you would turn it off there, and you'll see now it won't render. So I'll probably just, in this example, I should have probably done this, like just turned off these, because and the reason for that is so I can do a very basic light separation in my comp. I don't know how long this will take to render, but you know, even if it doesn't take that long to render, then we can separate the lights and do a very basic rebuild of each separate light on each separate render layer. So what I did in part 1 or 2 was I changed the driver here, because by default when you create a render pass it'll be on that, but then when I turn on the all light groups AOV on these passes, I'll just get an Arnold error, so it won't work. But just resetting this driver seems to work fine. So in your active AOVs, if you want to follow along, change specular to all light groups. So this will be our reflections, and this is pretty much the beauty, like our base color maps and everything else. So I've got all light groups turned on. And what I might do now is just do a quick render and show you what comes out from doing that. Okay, so I've re-rendered, and so our beauty will look the same, but now you can see in my drop down for passes, I've got this influx of passes. It's just the diffuse and specular and then all the separate lights. So if I look at the diffuse, this is everything together minus the reflections. So when popping different lights, separating them into comp, technically we could just use the diffuse, but if you'll notice, compared to the beauty, how much the reflections play a part. So that's why we are separating, we are creating light groups for specular and diffuse. So let's just go through them quickly, so we can actually see how much of an impact it's having. Before we run through the lights, I will say certain sections I will in a minute separate these 3D objects into separate layers, like this sign here, this wooden panel, boarded up windows, and this tankard, that will be foreground. This room on the left hand side that we can't really see at the moment, that's going to be like mid-ground render layer, and this brick wall and barn and whatever else is in the background, that will be our third render layer, so I'll call that background layer. So let's take a look at the lights. So diffuse softbox, so we can see it's having a bit of an effect. It's spilling out into here, which is similar to the plate, but we only really care about it affecting this area, so it doesn't really matter that it's spilling out there. If this was really extreme, then we would have to bring it down, because although we're separating this area onto a separate render layer, it would be really noticeable if this area was really intense and then there was no lighting effect there. What else? So this is our diffuse HDR. In part 1 of this lighting tutorial, we altered it. So that's just a nice ambient glow that we're getting there. Spotlight 1, that hits where the baby is. So even though we're not rendering an object there, we are getting some bounce on our wooden panels, possibly a little bit there, but it's going to be quite minute. Spotlight 2, this for the top bit there, so it's mainly affecting the sign. It could be affecting the planks. Yeah, so when I put up the exposure, it is so diffuse softbox 2. This is the big main one, so we can see it's affecting the background a lot. So after we do our first comp of the render, we might want to consider reducing that. Softbox 3, this is the light I popped in there based on the background actor's light, how the background actor's face was being lit. This is probably, it might be a bit too soft. It's too hard to tell at the moment, so I'll just leave it there anyway. So the specular, we could do the same thing running through here, but it's probably good to just set up our render layers and just work through this. Now I could actually just render this with the AOVs and put it into comp, but I want to separate the certain sections now because then I'll have more control and I can just turn on overrides for render layers. Like if I want to reduce specific lights for the background, then I can do that without affecting anything else here, and it will help me adjust those lights. So I'm going to go into my render layers and I'll do an example one, but then I will pause the video and then just do my other ones. So for the moment I'm going to do the foreground objects. So in your render setup, which is Windows, Render Editors, Render Setup, you want to create, you need to create a new render layer. So you hit this white button with a plus. I'm just going to call this foreground. So I'll just make it as basic as possible. So foreground is going to be our front objects. Now I need to right click, create a collection. So I'll just call it render objects. And if this scene was organized, then I'll be able to select the group and add the group, but unfortunately it's not, so I'm just going to quickly select my objects and add them into that layer. So it's just these 5 objects. So I've put that in there, and now we need to create a collection, because if I render this now, we just have these objects being lit, but they won't have any shadows. You can see there's shadowing and stuff. So I won't render an example of that. But the foreground, now we need to add our shadow object. So I'll create another collection object and I'll call it light blockers. And I have actually grouped everything here. So if you do have objects in your scene that are just there to block light, to create this diffuse, because these light blockers, they will actually affect some of the reflections and color spill, so you might want to just group them into a particular area. So anyway, I've grouped mine so I can add that group, so that's good. So what I'll do is I'll swap to this layer, so I'll view it, and now you can see these are all my objects in there. I've just noticed that I'm missing the steps, so it might be worth me just adding those back in. So what I'll do is I'll select those steps and I'll add them in, and then I'll do a render to see how it's looking right now. So this is what the render looks like. Let's compare it to the one before. So there's no difference in our foreground object, so that's fine. I suppose we could actually add the entire other scene as shadow objects, but for this project I think that's fine. So I'm going to save a snapshot. Something to keep in mind, actually, depending on the amount of objects and render layers you've got, you might need to create multiple light blocker type groups. In this example, I've created the one in my render setup. So I've got these light blockers, which are the shadow, I'm calling it the shadow group. Because I'm not rendering these assets, so at the moment they just have a grey lambert on. So I've put them into this separate light blockers group. But let's say you had some other assets in your shot on the right hand side. So for my foreground layer, I've got the sign, the wooden planks, this tankard. But let's say we had some other stuff here, but we wanted to put them on a separate render layer. It would be, I would advise creating another light blocker or another shadow render layer collection, including these objects, because but not having any overrides, as in this light blocker group, because these objects all have a grey lambert on, that's going to affect the reflections and the light spill, the colour spill onto our foreground objects. So if we had another asset, say if we had a treasure chest or something on the right hand side, we wanted to render it separately, we would want any of these textures from or this metal to reflect or spill onto our CG asset. So that's something to be aware of, because I'm about to add a shader override for my light blocker group. So the first thing I need to do is, in my render, you can see I've got my shadow geometry, so I don't want them rendered. So I can create an absolute override. So I've selected just one random object in my scene, and I'll go to the shape tab in my attribute editor. And I want to right click on primary visibility and do create absolute override for visible layer. So as I have my collection selected, it's now created this absolute override for that layer, so I can turn that off. So that's good. So when we render, we won't be able to see it. But because they are grey at the moment, all these objects, as I talked about in part 2, we need to apply the, I created a projection of the plate. So I thought what it would be good is having this plate, because our foreground objects are being put on top of the plate, what we can do for these assets is we can project this plate onto our shadow geometry, because they're pretty much laid out in their exact place from the plate, and they'll just give off the color of the footage, which is great. So I did do this in part 2. I can't remember if my scene crashed before then, so I'm just going to quickly reset it up now. So I might already have this in the scene, but I'm not sure. So what I need to do first is I'm going to create an AI projection, what's it called, camera projection node, and then in my projection color I need to add the plate. I'm going to link my camera to the render camera, and I just need to find, actually my footage might be in there somewhere. Oh well, I'm going to reload it anyway. So I've got my plate in there, and I'm going to turn on, oh, where is it? Yeah, we don't get as many options in the Hypershade for the property editor. So on the right hand side, I need to go to the attribute editor and turn on image sequence. So this, actually no, I don't want to do that. Depends what's happening in the scene, but it's probably not advisable. This is just a quick little addition. This is recorded after this entire video that you're watching. I just wanted to make a note about the surface shader thing. So you shouldn't have image sequence on, and because of this, the setup of this project and the students I'm working with, I just said to project, because the shot is only a few frames, we're only rendering like 100, so it's just moving forward, so we can get away with it. But if you are using a projection shader on a shot, like in our example it moves forward, so it means that every time the camera is moving forward, it's projecting onto the geometry which is there. So that just means whatever is in the plate, you know, if an actor walks by, they're gonna start being projected onto the footage. So another thing you can do is to create a separate camera. So let's say this is the first frame of our render camera. So I could just duplicate that. So I've duplicated it, and at the moment it's locked, but I just want to check that. Okay, so now we've got because we've duplicated it on the first frame, we now have the positioning of it. So in this instance, it might actually be better to just duplicate the camera on the first frame if you want to project from your camera and then keep the same position, because so if I just rename this to projection cam, so now as my other camera animates, we have the projection camera, which is, you know, projecting the footage from the first frame. Because our shadow objects are not moving, although our render camera is moving closer to the CG objects, our projection needs to be done from the same area of the plate. But again, keep in mind that if you turn render image sequence on, if someone walks in front, like even though your camera's not moving, like if an actor walks in front of this area, for example, they will get projected onto that, onto this piece of geometry. So it can be good and bad. You know, I just wanted to make you aware that it's probably a better practice to actually duplicate your render cam on the first frame, or you could even just project. You could use this technique and just project certain areas. Like you could project certain elements of the plate into different areas. Like this wall, you could project something onto there. You know, it's just a quick way of texturing things as well. And I figure I should mention that. So using, now that you know about the projection camera setup, what you could do is you could actually use this if you did want to texture, easily texture things, like without even unwrapping them. Like if you've got a lot of dense geometry that's far away. So let's say this background area here, if I wanted to easily texture that, I could actually duplicate this camera and just project an image that spans across that whole area. I have heard of that technique being done in various films, like I think some of the environments in Inception, they were just projection cameras, so you could make an AI. You don't have to use a surface shader. In this instance, I just used a basic surface shader, but you could create a projection camera and then just position it to whatever you want to have a shader and texture on, and then you can actually adjust the you know, the shader accordingly. The only thing with that is because things aren't textured properly, you know, it'll look, the base color will look good, but then the specular and lighting, you won't have as much control of that depending on what you're texturing. Like if you just want to project, so let's say we didn't want to texture this entire area here and we just photoshopped a barn and a pathway, then we could put that in the base color, but then it would be incredibly difficult to make a proper roughness and specular input, for example. So it has its pros and its cons, but I just thought I'd put it out there to make you aware. So I'm just going to rename the file of this footage that I loaded in. And okay, so that's plugged into my camera projection. And now we need to put it on a shader. So we've linked the camera and we've added in our footage. And now I'm going to create a surface shader. So I'm hitting tab. Otherwise, a surface shader is just a very basic shader that you can find in the My Favorites tab. This is just a flat shader. It doesn't have much settings, but it can be quite useful. You can see on the right hand side, we only have 4 options for it anyway. So I'm going to rename this to projection_shader. And I'm going to middle mouse drag my AI camera projection into the out color. So now this should be okay. Like I could apply this to my render layer. So with the light blockers added and selected, my collection group, I'm going to right click the collection and do create material override, and then I need to middle mouse drag. Where's my hype shade? I think this would be easier doing it on two monitors, but I'm trying to make sure you can see everything. Where is it? Okay. So I'm just going to drag the shader group into the material, the override material. So you can see we've got the light blockers group. We're hiding them from the render. So they're still in there, they're just casting shadows and reflections, and then we're applying our projected plate. So it's just going to be like having the footage reflecting onto our other object. So what I'm going to do is just pause the recording and re-render that. Okay, so I've done the render. I put the image there, so maybe I'll take that off. So we had the before and then the after, and you can really see immediately like how much of an impact like adding this surface shader makes. So I totally recommend doing that sort of thing for your own VFX projects. There are pros and cons though. If I turn the footage back on, keep in mind that because so our geometry is pretty much lined up with everything, but we're projecting straight from our render camera. So that means everything that is straight in front, let's say these actresses that are there in the plate, they would be projected exactly to where the geometry is. So let's take a look. So we have this wall here with the shader on it, the projection shader. If I just isolate this, so we did cut out holes, but it means you know, this inner archway here, for example, would have all the plate projected on them. So this inner archway probably has this woman's head and some of the other actor that's behind them projected onto them. So we might have to make an adjustment for that. You know, some surfaces, sometimes you can get away doing this sort of thing, but that's something to keep in mind. I think in this instance, the spill from our surface shader isn't too great. So if there's, sorry, I mean, it's not affecting this particular object too much. So for the moment, I'm going to leave it. Otherwise, we would have to put some form of texture, you know, maybe create a texture from the plate of that particular area to then put onto our particular shadow objects. But that's something that, you know, is project and shot dependent. But for particular areas, like you can see here, we were getting so much just flat grey spill on our tankard, and now we actually have this brown soil, cement, whatever it is. We're getting a lot more spill, which is really good for this. So in this instance, it will work. You know, for the other sections, will it work? Or will we need to do it? Let's say for this background area that we have, we're going to get some color spill from this ground area, this shed, and the wall that was on the left hand side. So we would have to keep that in mind. Like if our projection, like when we project, like if we did use this projection shader for this background area, then looking at the plate and before, we're going to end up getting some of this well projected onto our object here. You can actually see where the well is. So if I use the projection shader for the shadow objects on my background layer, we're going to get the well showing up on this box, which is incorrect. So we might have to create some textures for this background shed, or we could try and you know, take this part of the plate and then turn that into a really rough texture for this, just so we get some decent spill that is from the plate onto our CG. But you know, this will come up later. But at the moment, the before and after that we have is look pretty good for like this pub sign as well. I think I just want to double check like how much. I think it'll be more noticeable if I turn up the exposure as well, like do the before and after. You can really see how we're going from the flat or white slight reflection to a much more in keeping sort of warm glow. So that's great. Okay, now what I'm going to do is, so I've done that, I'll just check my render layers, but I think I can move on and create some other render layers as well, and then I'll do some test renders. I'm not going to record the creation of the render layers, but as I said before, I'm just going to do one for the left-hand side room and the background. So I'll just have the 3 render layers for different bits. Right, so I've set up the render layers. I'm just going to show you what I've got for them. So I do have the foreground, midground layer and background, and I set them up in the same way as I was doing the foreground one. The only exception is I haven't added a material override for my light blockers. So to recap, the material override was that surface shader that has the plate projecting to give us these nicer sort of reflection spill for these foreground objects. Might as well turn on the plate in the background so you've got a bit more context. You know, rendering different layers separately will give us an alpha, like if I just separate them. So when I press A, it means they're cut out, so we can literally just add a merge node in Nuke and just overlay them. Or I'm sure you could do the same in any other software that you are also using. I've got the midground, which will be my room. So you can see in the alpha, this is the section. I've just selected these objects, including the back wall, because they're the only bits that will be seen, and then everything else will be a shadow blocker. It looks very dark at the moment. We need to add more lights in there to actually show it, but for the moment, I was just trying to match the lights that we used on set, and then we can start to do our own thing, add a bit of firelight in there, for example. But turning up the exposure, you can see there is a whole room of assets in there. And we have the background layer. This one there, you can see we're getting the shadow from that geometry I added, the block, because there's a shed in the plate. So that's fine. This is very bright, but as I've said, we just put in the first lights and then we'll take it from there. Each render layer, they've inherited the AOVs that I turned on at the start. So if you remember, I turned on the diffuse and the specular AOV, and I enabled all light groups on for them. And because we renamed all the different lights, it means I can now flick through for each render layer. I could go through what each light is doing on the reflections and in the diffuse pass as well. So that's pretty neat. Okay. Now what we would do, I could begin to add further layers, but because we are just starting off with the lighting, I'm going to set up a single frame to render this, and then I will jump into Nuke and then show you how to set this up. So if you've not rendered before, I'm going to go to the Common tab. I'm just going to render my first frame. So I'm going to change my first frame in this sequence is 1051. Make sure your render cam is there, and you can pick an image size. If your VFX shot is big and you're rendering it like, or let's say it's taking a long time to render, what you could do is, if your footage is HD or if it's 2K, 4K, etc., you could, you know, in this instance, I could render half res and then I could scale it up, just add a reformat in Nuke. But because the render time's quick for me, I'm gonna leave that at 1080. The settings, again, the render setting, I'm gonna leave low for the moment. And the only other thing I changed was, actually, I think that's fine. Just make sure you've got merged. Actually, merge AOVs probably won't be useful for us because of the glitch that I said that occurs with the AOVs. That's why we changed the driver. So all of these passes will come in separate folders. So when I've rendered it, I'll show you, but we'll end up getting a folder for each of these. So we'll get a foreground, midground, background. Then inside there, there'll be a folder called diffuse and then one called specular. Then inside there, we'll get a separate image sequence for each light, or it will just be a single diffuse sequence, then with the lights to break out, but we'll take a look when that comes. Actually, a quick note for anyone that's not sure how to render their sequence. Once you've changed the render settings and the amount of frames you want, what you want to do is you can hold down spacebar, go to render. If you're running on a full license of Maya, you can do a batch render, so you can just click this and then it will start initializing the render, and then it will begin doing your sequence. And if you do that, you can then check, you can have sort of a kind of like a render bar. If you open up your script editor, then it will say, you know, frame blah blah blah, and then it'll do a progress like a loading bar. If you're on a student license, then you can do you could do a sequence render. So you go to render sequence. The reason for doing this is on a student license you will get a watermark on your renders that says Arnold. So to avoid that, you can do a render sequence and then change your render camera. If you've got more than one render cam, you do all render enabled cameras, and you just want to make sure this is turned on and pick your file output. So you probably want to render to your images folder of your project. So you just pick that and then click render sequence and close. The difference between a render sequence and a batch render is this will probably be slightly more heavy on your computer because it renders each frame and it does that in front of you, but then it saves them. So it's kind of annoying, but if you have to do it, you've got to do what you got to do. So I'll come back once it's rendered. So just to quickly jump in, when I was talking about the master layer, I've added a few notes in this video just talking about, you know, when you render out light AOVs for your different passes, it depends how you want to see things, because if we separate everything out, we will have, you know, these different light groups there, but then we are missing the indirects. So I tried to quickly add them in, which you'll see in the video. But if we want to do this with the master layer, we would also include, if you want the full control, you know, so we need the specular reflections. That's what we were missing from this area here. So in Maya, I just added in the specular indirect and then changed the driver, turn on all light groups, and then I turned off all these render. Actually, in fact, I didn't even render these render layers, but as an example, I think earlier in the video I turned off the render layers on one of them. So then in Nuke you'll get the same thing, we'll do the same setup, but then what you would do is then include a layer. So then that says background beauty, but this is the, I swapped out, so this is the master layer beauty. If I could just rename this master layer beauty. So you get a similar setup in your folders. So this is the folder that I rendered to, then you get master layer, and so these are my other render layers that I rendered previously. But you'll get the master render layer. So this is everything combined, this one, and the name here, lighting example, that's just the name of my scene, and then the frame number that I rendered. Then we'll get a separate folder for each AOV that we've turned on, and then it has our lights just separated. We've only rendered one frame, so it's just the first frame of each. Otherwise, if you render your entire sequence, keep in mind you will have a folder full of loads of images, just each separate light for the entire sequence. So what I'm going to do now is just begin to merge in these specular indirects. If I can copy and paste some of these nodes across, I'm literally going to do the same thing. So for this shuffle, for some reason on the HDR, I think it's because I've got merge AOVs turned on, I have to shuffle out the HDR. So I will copy this shuffle across to here, do the same thing, and then I'll just hook these up in the same way just before adding my light controllers. It's just because I did notice that we were missing some of the indirect bounce lights, which is most noticeable with, in this example, in the sign. So because there's a lot of color spill from our projection shader that we didn't have. So that's why I've now added this in. So I'm just going to hook this up now, and then I'll show you the controller. So just to quickly show you what it looks like, so I added in the specular indirect passes and then just connected them on top of, I just added it into I copy and pasted from what you'll end up doing in the video and just added them along as well. I'm sure there's probably a better way of doing this. After a while it does begin to look a bit messy as well, but then everything still connects back in, so we just have, you know, everything on the left going on top of the diffuse pretty much, and they all connect in there. One thing I did notice was a light that I created later in this video, the firelight. I couldn't see it in the folder when I dragged everything across, but it actually merged inside this main diffuse, this main pass. Each of these renders AOVs has essentially a main pass which just has the spec indirect, for example, for everything. Then this one has the specular for everything, and this one has the diffuse for everything. That's where we're shuffling out the HDR from, but for some reason the firelight was included in there as well in my example. Ideally all of these other passes would be merged into there, but I know it won't happen because we separated the driver, because it causes some Arnold error. So in an ideal world we would just have one node and then shuffle everything throughout there, but I don't know, so I haven't worked out why it's given us this, but you know, I just thought I'd make you aware because it's still connected in the same way. But that's what it looks like. And we're back. There we go. So they've rendered out. This is the folder. So in your folder, mine's set up differently. I didn't actually have a project set up because I was borrowing students' scene just to do this. So yours would be in an image folder if you have created a project window. So you go File, Project Window, New Project, set your project, and then it should go into your Images folder. So anyway, my scene was called Lighting Example 3, so I jump in there and we can see I've got 3 folders, which are my background, foreground, mid. So when I open each one, you'll see, as I predicted, we get the diffuse folder, we get the specular, and this file here is the beauty. And the naming convention is like the scene dot frame number dot extension, which would be an EXR, which we left as, I think that's the default. So we have the same thing for each layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up the background, and so I'll just check in here. So we have these 3 different files for our diffuse, so I can drag that in. Oops, there we go. Let's take a look. Just to double check what these are. So softbox 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have this file here. So I can see that these renders from my diffuse, they have these red, green, and blue colors, which means we've got RGB information in there. And we can see in the thumbnail of this node, then we can actually select it, press a number, and actually view what is there. This one at the end, to check what's inside it, because it's not displaying RGB, but it has this green icon. I can press show layers, and what do we have in there? So for this one, it has created our diffuse beauty and the diffuse HDR in one. Okay, that's interesting. So it looks like in this instance what has happened is, because we've got merge AOVs on, it's only actually merged some of them. It's only merged the HDR into one. So in an ideal world, all of these passes would have been merged into this one, but that's fine, we can work with that. So I just thought I'd check what was there. So what I'm going to do is try and organize these a bit better. So I've dragged these in, I know these are the diffuse. So I'm going to make a backdrop. So I'm going to hit tab, go to backdrop, created a backdrop. Okay, so let's call this, what folder were they from? They were from our background. So I'm going to call this background underscore diffuse. And I'm going to do the same for the specular. So I'm just going to drag, whoopsie daisy, drag and drop. Can't seem to do that. Using a tablet and it's not happy. Okay, and then I select them and I press L just to put them in a line. Create a backdrop again. These are going to be called background underscore specular renders. Great. I didn't write renders in that one. Cool. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab this single render on its own in the background folder. This will be our beauty. So when I read that, it's essentially all these combined. So we can use that as a reference. So that's where we start, and then when we start to mess with these, we can look at where we're going to end up. So now what we want to do is basically combine, match these lights up essentially. So what I mean by that is you can see we've got softbox 1 and then we have a softbox 1 there. So the reason for doing this is we want to separate our lights. So now we have them separated, and we know that if we combine each one of these together, so softbox 1 with softbox 1, I press Control and then select a point to create a point. So when I do that and I read this, I can't see much, it's pretty dark. Okay, I guess that one's not affecting the scene. But let's do it again for another example. So merge over, let's do softbox 2 because I can see something in there. So match up softbox 2 with softbox 2. And let's read the result. Cool, there we go. So this is just that softbox 2, which was the very big light behind my set. So that's there, that is now isolated. That is essentially our beauty, which is here. So let me read from that. So that's our beauty. As you can see, softbox 2 is having a great effect on this background area, but we're isolating it to get this. So now we know, okay, this is our full background layer, background render just of that light. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to link up these other lights in the same way. So hopefully that makes sense. We're putting the diffuse in the background because the specular render is a reflection, so it goes on top. I'm not changing anything from the default merge either. So I'm just going to pause the video and then connect everything else up. Okay, I've added the other ones. I just remembered for this example, this one that's called lighting example, that's where Maya has tried to merge the render passes. So this is the one where we ended up having the diffuse render and a light on its own. So because I'm trying to rebuild everything, I need to shuffle out the RGB information for that pass. So what I will have to do is I'll select this node, hit tab, search for a shuffle node. So this will enable us to extract the information from this particular pass. So in the drop down of the shuffle node, I'm going to scroll down and we can see we have a diffuse HDR. All these other passes that are here, that's just information throughout my comp. There's actually a lot of things going on in this comp. If I zoom out, you can see. Just ignore this, although I'll just say it's pretty much different examples of how this shot can be comped that I've used in I think other tutorials. I'm not sure if all of them were recorded, but it's pretty much the same thing over and over, but slightly different. So it's a bit like Groundhog Day for me. Anyway, shuffle node. Yeah, so we know we used a layer contact sheet to check what was in there, so we know that there is a diffuse HDR in there. So I'm going to read from here, and as you can see, we have the diffuse HDR. Cool. So I might as well change the name of this shuffle node, so I'll call it shuffle underscore diffuse. Whoops, diffuse. Oh, I can't spell diffuse underscore HDR. Cool. See if I can just copy and paste this across. But now what I need to do is change it, because remember this are specular renders on the left hand side. So I'm going to change this to specular HDR and change the name to specular HDR, and I'll read this just so we can see. Wicked, there we go. One thing that's worth mentioning is these passes, you can see that they've got RGB information, but they don't have the white dot. You see we have the white dot in here. That's an alpha. And an alpha is kind of like a mask. Well, it is essentially a mask. So when I read from this, we have the white alpha dot. So when I press A, you'll see on the top, so we get this white cutout of the object. And you'll see when I hit A, it changes this top bit from RGB to alpha. So when we've combined all these, something to keep in mind is that they won't have an alpha. So we have this beauty, so we can just copy and paste that alpha into these. And the reason we need an alpha is if we want to slap this over something else, we need an alpha. So we need that cutout, because that's yeah, that will be used when we overlay things. Right, so we've joined all these together. Now what I want to do is, in order to control, this is where we create the lights controller, which essentially is just an exposure for each of these. So I just realized I haven't actually merged these two there, so I'll quickly do that now. So we're getting this nice little pattern of nodes, and they're all just doing the same thing. So it might look confusing, but these are just the lights. We're just doing this so we can control our lights. And then down here, I'm going to copy this exposure a few times. But before I do that in the exposure, I'm going to change one thing. In the adjust in, I'm going to change this to stops. And then this should mean that when we render out our sequence and then we change, so let's say, actually, what is this plugged into? Okay, as an example, I'll plug it in something more obvious. Right, so I'm going to read from here. So this is our main, our strongest light in our scene for the, so we can change the exposure, let's say -1, -2, okay. Let's say we've done that and we're happy with that. Everyone we're working with is happy with it as well. So then we can go back in Maya and select that particular light, which we know is softbox 2, and then we can change our exposure. We can reduce it by 2 numbers, and then repeat the process again until we want to do a final full render. It's just a much faster way of working and doing iterations. So if anyone is working as a lighting TD in a company, you'll end up doing this similar process. It's really efficient way of working. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording and just add in some exposures in this line. So what I've done was I just copy and pasted the exposure a few times. I renamed each one as I went along, just so I know exactly which light it's going to affect, just for neatness, because once we've done this setup for this background, then we can literally just copy and paste everything pretty much. So now we need to just combine, whoops, we need to combine the results of these sections as well. So what I'm going to do is just start merging these bits together. So it'll be A over B. Let's see if we could just make a big line. So B is background. So the HDR, I'm just using that as the first one in this example. And I'm just making this chain, and I can neaten it up once I've finished. So I'm just going to do that and then check that everything's okay. Cool. So I just checked it. So, oh my gosh, what is going on? Right, so I've just merged these just on top of each other. I'll probably neaten these up in a second, but you don't need to watch that. So these are just basic mergers. You can see when you hit M on the keyboard, it creates a merge node, standard with the operation as over. Okay, so let's view this, and I'm going to press, okay, I'll press 1 on this and 2 on this, just so I can view them at the same time. As I switch between, no changes. So it's the same thing. But now, what I can do is, when I view this area, I can now more interactively change particular lights. So let's say I want to reduce this down in terms of the intensity. I think I already worked out it was the softbox 2 was causing that. So let's take a look. Ah, okay. So now I could bring it down a few stops. So that's better. So I've reduced that, and let's take a look at what softbox 1 is doing. So softbox 1 is not doing anything. I think softbox 1 is the light in the side room, so that it's having 0 effect, but that's fine. Just think it's good to keep it there anyway, because if we were seeing it, then that would mean that there's something wrong with our light blockers. So what is this? Softbox 3. So that's the light to the right hand side of this area. I could have named these in a more specific way. That could help, but doesn't really matter. So I guess I would like to bring up the exposure of that by 1. Because it softens up these shadows there. Cool. And spotlight 1, so this would be the initial light for the baby. Whoa, okay. It's not having any effect, but that's fine. But you can see what we'd end up getting if we increased it to a higher exposure. So if we put it on 10, we're going to introduce a lot of this noise, so let's forget about that. It's pretty much having 0 effect. Spotlight 2, let's play around with that. So this would be the light that was hitting the roof house. Let's take a look at the plate. I've got the plate in here somewhere. So it'd be the light up here. Where is it? Spotlight 2. Sorry, I need to read through that area again. Let's play with spotlight 2. Okay, it's already loaded on the right hand side. It's not having too much of an effect, but we could make it so. That's interesting. Okay, I should really put this in a slap comp before I continue playing with it, but you get the gist. Like, we can then go through our lights, we can start playing with it. But at the moment we don't have a plate in the background, so we're just kind of making up stuff. So I'm going to leave those adjustments for the moment, and this process that I've just done here, I'm going to repeat for the other layers. So right now, what we can do, so I'll put a backdrop on this. Remember, this is like the reference, because this is our beauty render. So this is everything combined. So when we initially combined everything and we we were looking through the very end of it, we ended up with that. But now that we've done this, we can now control each light for this background area, which is pretty neat. So I'm going to do the same for the midground and the foreground, and then I'll put in the footage in the background. Cool. I figured I might as well include what I'm actually going to do. So when I mean copy and paste, I will actually literally select that, press Ctrl C, then Ctrl V, and when I'm just going to shift this to the left slightly, and I'm literally going to just wipe these, just select all the nodes and delete them, and then reload in my midground. So I'll change the names of these, but that's literally what I meant. The only thing we might have to change, we'll just have to double check that it's shuffling out the correct thing, but that should be fine because these are shuffling out. It's going to be the same AOV, but just for like the midground layer. So I'm going to just do that, but I thought I would just make you aware I am literally copying and pasting. Okay, now I'm onto my foreground layer. I thought I would just reiterate that, you know, when we first did the background, you know, the order of these render passes, I wouldn't worry too much about them. If you end up putting them in a different order, it should still be fine. But because we just dragged and dropped our different passes in, they should end up being the same. So as an example, what I did, so with the specular, I'm just dragging in my specular for my foreground. So I'm just about to delete these. So all I did was dragged and dropped them in, selected them, and hit L. And because I use that as my default lineup, then that means whenever I do the same for the next layer, they'll be in exactly the same order anyway. But I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that. One other thing, what I've been doing is, so at the very end, so there's my background area, then I just added a merge after, and then I put my midground on top of the background. So you see the B goes into the background, which is up there. Yeah, so I'll jump back in once I have finished this foreground. So I've connected all these layers up, but when I view it, so this might happen to you, so then I'll show you what's wrong. So we can see we have some transparency issues going on there. When I hit A, there's no alpha, so I mentioned this before. So in order to fix this, we got the beauty render. I did mention that you see these all have RGB, which is fine. Well, apart from this one, but we've already talked about that, shuffled it out. But we do have the beauty. So we can grab that alpha for each bit and just pop it in the bottom bit down here. So because we want to copy that, we're going to hit tab, search for copy. So it says copy channel. And by default, you can see it's going to go alpha to alpha. So that's pretty useful. So we can pop the A in there. And I'm just going to, I want this to look as neat, as tidy as possible. So I'm just going to keep adding these in. And I will pop that in there. So let's do a before and after of that. So this should be before. So I'm pressing A, but there's nothing there. Now when I do after, look at that. Now we have an alpha. So we've now got a clear cutout that we can slap on top. So we'll do the same. I'm going to add in a copy node for each. So I could just put a copy node in here and connect it to my midground beauty, and then I'm going to do the same for the foreground. So I'm just going to pop it in here. So after all my lights are connected, that's where I'm putting it. And just so when I put these layers together, we won't get that weird ghostly effect. Transparency, I should just say. Cool, so that's done. It's done. I've put something there on the side. I just want to talk about another way you could do this, which might be easier, might be more confusing. So now we have alphas for everything. Let's press A, Cool. Now we have all these cutouts, and because we created separate render layers, it means each different section that we've got. So let's just look at the foreground. So I'm just reading through my copy node for the foreground. There we have it. All the lights for the foreground separated. We hit A and there's an alpha. And I've just realised there's something in the background. God damn it. Don't know what that is. Oh well. Actually, I think it's screws. There are screws in this wooden plank. There's some screws in the background. Ah, okay. I can't see them anyway, so that's fine. So now we have light controllers for each render layer. That's pretty cool. So it means we can go onto our render layers in Maya. We can adjust them here, and then if we want to change that in Maya, then when we when we adjust the lights in comp, we can go back to our render layers and we could jump to, let's say, the foreground, and then say if our foreground we changed the HDR in Nuke, then we could go window, we could go to our light editor just to give us a list of the lights. This is an easier way of just seeing everything, and we can go, oh okay, we changed our HDR by, we upped the exposure node in Nuke by 2. So then what we could do, whilst viewing our foreground layer, we could right click, go create absolute override for layer. You'll see when I drop down in there, it adds an override there. But we could change it here or there. You can see it's changed orange, so then I could change this. I could add 2 to that. So 10.5, you see it's changed there. Cool, it's as easy as that. And then if I want to get rid of it, then I can either like right click and hit ignore when rendering, or I can delete it in here. Delete this one, you'll see it reverts back there. Okay, let's say you don't want to make it as confusing as this, because this looks confusing, but you know what it is. It's like all the different lights. The only reason we've copy and pasted is because of our render layers. So, you know, if you just had a master layer, you would only have to do this once. If you just did it, you know, with one single layer. Another way of doing it, if we wanted to control all our lights at the same time, I've done a mini example. So let's say you've got your different layers, but you'd rather control all the lights affecting, have all the lights affecting each other at the same time. Then what you would do is a similar sort of process, but you can see what I've done here is I've put my different render layer passes together. So I've got my diffuse for all my render layers there. And I've just gone in, I've done an example with one light. I picked the softbox 2, which is the biggest light. So we can see the thumbnail there, it's showing a lot of light. And I've just literally done A over B, so background, mid, I'm just popping one on top of the other. And then I do the same with my specular passes, so I find the light that I want, spotlight to, softbox 2, I do A over B, blah blah blah. And then I join the two. Remember that the diffuse is pretty much most of the render. So then we're applying our specular, so the reflections on top. So that's why we have the B going up here, then the A there. And I pop in an exposure at the end. I know this isn't laid out in a very nice way, so I'm not trying to confuse you, it's just I'm quite lazy. So let's read through here. So because we've combined all the different layers, we can see everything in our scene, but through this exposure we've just created, this should be for softbox 2. So you could do that process, like if you didn't want to change your lights for each separate render layer, you know, you can do it. I mean, you can still do this process with, if you want to affect every layer, you could just pick one light, softbox 1, change it by 1 here, then just change it by 1 there and 1 there. Or if you want to do it all together, yeah, this is just the way you do it. If you want to do both in a comp, what you could do is you could actually, actually I'll leave it for the moment, yeah. But I was thinking you could just link some of these exposures. But yeah, this is a way that you can do it if you wanted to. So rather than copy and paste these nodes as well, if you wanted to have this set up at the same time, I think what I was gonna say was we could use postage stamp nodes. So let's say we wanted to, because all we need is these few mergers and then an exposure. So you could create another set of controllers. And in fact, I might as well illustrate what I'm talking about now. So if I create a postage stamp node, this is just linking from one area to another. So this is just an empty node. So when we look in the right hand side, there's a label. So we can type whatever we want. So I could put diffuse, I could put foreground diffuse underscore softbox 2. And then what I could do is I could drag this to the foreground. It's actually, where is it? It's down there, okay. Or what I could do is I could select it and I can shift select. So now I've got 2 highlighted and I can press Y. See, it's just zapped over there. And now you can see in the thumbnail, we actually see the result. The cool thing about a postage stamp is you can then hide the input. So when I click away from it, it looks like it's just a single floating node, but it is linked elsewhere. That's pretty cool as well, because if we then update our foreground render for the next pass, this will link as well. But because we've done this, now what we could do is we can swap out our connection there as well. So, you know, there's a few ways you could do this. You know, you could then repeat that process, so you could just have postage stamps here instead. Because the other way, I guess, would be a bit more messy. If you wanted to have these merge nodes and this controller on the right hand side, you'd end up having to stretch merge nodes. So I'd have to click on this merge and then join it down there, and then I've got this. I'm going to end up with a lot of lines just crossing over and over. So, but yeah, that's how you can control just all your lights for everything. But we've already separated the render layers as well. So now the next step would be to put in the background. So just to recap, I'm just going to read through here. So select that merge. So this is where we're at. So we need some footage in there. So let's get the plate. I'm going to add in another merge, favorite node, and my plate somewhere else in this comp. So I'm just going to pinch it. Just going to pop it down here. So Control C, Control V, and this is the background. So I pop the B into the plate and pop the A into my CG. Come on. I'm resting stuff on this tablet and it's touch sensitive, so first world problem. Okay, so there's a few issues. Main issue is, well, our CG is just on top of it. So we're gonna need to do some form of roto. But what we do know is that our CG has alphas. So my foreground CG, we copied the alphas back in, so it means that this is already cut out. So now that I know that, and I know that this foreground bit is going to be in front of the majority of things, I think there's an actor that walks in front of it or something like that. But because, you know, we want to be as lazy as possible, we can now pop in. Come on. We can try pop it in, but Nuke won't let us. There we go, we could pop in the background behind this, the CG, the foreground. because it's all about this A over B. So you see there's a B there, so we're applying this foreground on top. So now let's read it, see what we get. It's better, slightly better. But now we need to go ahead and roto, so we need to add a mask in. I do already have a mask for this, but as an example, to cut things out from the plate, you need a roto node. Or you can just get, if you've got some black and white footage of, from external software. But if you're starting a VFX project, you're going to need to do some sort of cutting out. You'll notice as I just put in that roto node, everything is gone. So that's not great. But you can see that this this foreground stuff is looking fine. It just needs some of its own roto there. So when we create a roto node, we then need to create a shape. So I'm just going to draw out a square. And you see by default, as I shift it around, this is displaying our CG. When I press A, you'll see it's actually adding it's revealing our CG alpha. So we can display our CG, which is pretty cool. So there are two ways we could do this. We could start, cutting around our plate. So let's say this box here. So we can start doing that and stretching this over here, because a lot of this area we don't really want. It's all this stuff of the set you can see. We will need to add in further background, but this mask is just allowing us to reveal our CG. If you remember this shed, we put that as a background object. We want the shed. If this was a proper project, then I'm sure there would be further notes from directors or things like that, like what objects they want in. So then you would just have to abide by whatever that is. So then I could add some points. So I clicked this fountain pen, add points. So I just click there. I can press Shift Z to make it a harsh point, and so on, so forth. We do need the well in there, so you'd probably want to do a lot of different roto shapes. But that's all I'm going to show you for the moment, because I do already have roto for this, which thankfully was not done by me. Another thing to keep in mind is you can invert what you're doing with the roto as well. So as a quick example again, you go to the shape tab of your roto and you could actually invert the function of it. So what that means is it shows us the CG and then we are doing the opposite. So we're actually just highlighting the areas of the set that we don't want the CG to be seen through. So if I just loosely move the points there, and you see our CG on the right hand side, it actually ends there anyway, so it's not so bad, but we'd probably want to blend it in with the roto, that sort of thing. So you can work in the inverted way if that's clearer to you or not. And when I flick between the alpha, we can see what's happening. So we know our background has its own cutout, and we're essentially stopping it. So we're adding black, because I just inverted it, we're adding black on top of this background. So black is off, white is on, essentially, if that's an easy way of thinking about it. And because our foreground CG is on top of what we're doing right now, then we can use this alpha, so it's already cut out for us, so that's pretty cool. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the roto sequence that I have, and then I'm going to pop it in where that roto node is, and then I'll take a look. Okay, so I've added in my roto, so I had pre-made roto. You can see there it's black. We can just see there's got it's just an alpha channel in there. So when I press A, we can see that this is actually I think some green screen keying and roto combined into this particular matte. I had to reformat it because the original plate was 2K, but I'm working in HD. Then I inverted it. I said white is on, black is off, as a simple way of putting it. Because we already have alphas from our CG, so let's take a look. So we can see the white bits are on and the black bits are off. So that means we're going to see this. We're going to see our CG there. And then when we combine the footage, what we want to happen is we want to remove our CG from bits of the plate, so then we can overlay them. So the result, anyway, is this. And I even popped in another, using that principle of Roto, I even did the same. So the back, so if I hide this, disable it, sorry. I'll just change my background. So that's what we had before. And then using the same principle of alpha, then I can put in this picture from Lord of the Rings into the background and then mask just a particular area. I think I just cut somewhere on the side. So you can see my roto shape, it's just to there. If I just view from here, you see I just did the rough roto and I added a transform to move this picture of Mordor. And the result is this. So let's take a look at the foreground as well, applied. Cool. I forgot that this picture of Mordor is at a different resolution as well, and I've transformed it. So that means you can see we've got these dots around the edge. So what I need to do is just crop this as well before it comes back in. So when I look, okay, great. We don't have any lines. Okay, so this is our render. So now what we can start to do is we've separated everything. We've got our CG in. So this could be our slap comp. I should probably hide Mordor, but yeah, this is just sort of a learning example anyway. So now I can begin to look at each layer, or if you're doing it the other way that I said, controlling the lights for the whole scene, that's fine. But I've separated my render layers and I would just like to work separately with them. So that being said, I'm going to just zoom into my light controllers. So this, I'm going to look at the foreground first, and what I can do is one by one I can go through my lights and decide how I feel they're looking. So my softbox, what is this? Softbox. Oh yeah, you can't have the same name twice. So this is softbox 1. So I'd probably need to change the naming convention, but softbox 1 is actually inside the room. So it's quite good that it's not actually affecting our foreground elements. Let's look at the next light. So this would be the light hitting the baby. I believe this is softbox 2. Was it spotlight? No. Softbox 2. So I probably need to change the name of these anyway. So we could just start playing with these. You should probably just move in at 1 stop or 2 stop, or maybe even half a stop, rather than just pull it up and down. Okay, so let's ramp that up a bit. In fact, one extra thing I might just do now is quickly add some roto for the actors there, because it would be good to see what they're actually doing. So in order to do that, what I could do is I could add in a mask into, I could either add one in up here, I could also add a roto on top of this. Actually the CG is going on top, so I need to add a mask in down here. So I'll pop in a roto, because we're masking the addition, if that makes sense. So foreground is A, we're plugging the background and the background CG and the plate in there. So we just need to delete some of it. As you can see, by doing that straight away, now we're missing the CG. So I'm just gonna roughly cut around these people. So just a really rough little job. Okay, that will be fine. Whoops. Okay. Now we need to invert it. So I'll go to the shape, so you can control some other options with it, but I'll just invert that. There are feather options and things like that, but this is not some sort of roto video, and I'm not a compositor anyway, so as you can see, perfect roto VFX. That'll do. Okay. Now let's go back to the light exposures. I think I got to the second one. So how is that looking? I adjusted it by 2, 3. What we'll need to do when we jump back into Maya is change the light coloring as well, because we're getting a much more softer light. I can't remember if that was noticeable in the HDR, in the raw HDR that we had, but for those of you that have watched part 1, we did color grade the HDR anyway. So we should keep that in mind. We'll end up doing a similar thing for the lights. Not necessarily all of them, but it might be worth doing it for some of them. Right, so I'm just having a play with each of these lights. So this one is the spotlight 2. So you see it's the light that's meant to be hitting the box above everyone. That's interesting. So we're getting a bit of a stream where it hits our sign. As a caveat, I will say, I know the CG is not that great. It was textured literally in 15 minutes. Just procedural materials just slapped on and on and on across about 57 UDIMs. Let's look at the HDR. We did already set the HDR, and HDRs are costly to render, so we probably don't want to tweak this, but I will take a look at that. Do we need it? Would be good to lift up these shadowing areas a bit. That's all I'm concerned about. You know, we're getting like black CG shadows. Although we did put the surface shader onto our shadow, what are we calling them? Light blockers. Okay, let's say the HDR is up by 1, and this is spotlight 2. So let's pop that up by 1. Let's see how the tankards are looking. They're still pretty dark. We might need to add in a further fill. What light is that? Softbox 3. Okay, so that's the one at the back. That shouldn't even be having any effect, which it's not, so we can forget about that. Softbox 2, that's the big one. And we have to look at the set for reference. So I know this is some sort of shiny ceramic, but this is metal. That's going to be really blown out. So I could probably turn it up to 2. It's not so bad. We might need to include some other lights in there. What is this light? This is softbox number 1. I feel like I'm missing a light. So spotlight 1. I was kind of expecting a bit more from spotlight 1. Spotlight 1 should be. But anyway, we've tweaked the lights a little bit so we can read our beauty and then read from here. So I pressed 1 over here, 2 over here. So that's before and after, before and after. So looking at this, I might need to just check my connection because I was copying and pasting a lot. So I just need to check how things are connected up. So I'm going to do that and then come back. So I just realized something I forgot to mention at the very beginning. So hopefully I will add a note at the beginning of the video, but something we were missing was the bounce. So the indirect lights. So I'll show you what. So this is when we add our lights, you know, combined together. I'm reading from that alphabet, and now I've just overlaid in our our indirect. So the easiest way to do this, because it's not affecting the render too much, like we are doing most of the controls from here, I'm just overlaying this. So here, this is the actual the beauty render we had, but I'll add a note at the beginning or whenever we added the AOVs, just to drop back into Maya, and in your AOVs just add 1. That's literally it. So not that, it would be specular indirect. So these are the bounce lights we can see here. So it's not affecting the render that much, but it is removing some of those CG looking shadows. What we could do, if you really want, like for this example, I'm not going to do it, but I will say, so I've added it to the AOVs and I just re-rendered. I didn't change the render location again. I just turned off my other diffuse and specular and turned this one on whilst on my master layer, and I hit render again, and because I was rendering to the same location, it just overwrote my files, so I just had to reload. So if you've been following along and I didn't add the note about adding the specular indirect, then what you would need to do is do that and just re-render, so you'll end up re-rendering your beauty and your now your specular indirect. A better way of doing this, I think, is I will create a postage stamp down here, so just below our copy, so when we add in the alpha, I'm going to link the postage stamp up there. I could change the label of it, but it's linked pretty close. I'm going to go to the postage stamp and hide the input, and then from there I add a shuffle, so I can rename this because it's going to be shuffle underscore specular underscore indirect. So yeah, what I was going to say is that because we're just overlaying this single pass, keep in mind that this is the indirect speculars all combined. So it's not actually going to be taking in consideration these light changes. So as we alter these, if we wanted to have the full effect, we would have to end up creating light AOVs, light groups for this AOV and breaking it out this way. But the results in this particular shot would be less noticeable. So at the moment we're just using it to control just the main lights of the shot. So let's take a look. So this is the render. Have I shuffled this out? So I'll just double check my shuffle node. So specular indirect. So I can see that from there. shuffling out. There's nothing coming out of there, which is strange. Okay, well, right now it's not working, but I just want to show you the example. So I'm literally just going to copy and paste that beauty and then just plug this shuffle back in. Then I could add some backdrops over these nodes just in case I wasn't sure what they were doing. So now when it's comped back in, we will actually get these nice bounce reflections. So before I go any further, I'm going to just add that same bit in, whoops, to my other areas, my midground and my background, and then I'm going to start tweaking the other layers, the mid and the background. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the indirect specular. So because I overwrote everything, I could just go to my mid layer, copy and paste this, just put it, I could probably just pop it in here because it has an alpha, so we don't need to add the alpha in. We know it has the alpha because it's part of this. This is like the beauty. It's got all the it's got the extra AOVs combined, so we don't need to put it before the copy alpha. So this is just to give us a bit of the specular indirect, but as I say, it won't take into consideration any of these. So if you've got a lot of indirect light, you'd probably have to create all of this as well for your indirect speculars, which, you know, it would be cool, but it depends if it's necessary. At the moment, the idea in this instance is we're creating this just to be a light controller, and then when we're happy with the CG, we can probably forget about this unless we need to do any final light tweaks in the comp. Seeing as we'd already have it set up, we might as well leave it there. This is just the sort of basic type of setup that I've used in the past when doing lighting TD stuff on shows. So yeah, I'm going to add this node for each of the layers, do the shuffle and merge over my indirect shadows, and then I'm actually going to tweak the lights. You've seen me do an example with the foreground, so I'm going to tweak the lights and then show you the result I get before going back into Maya. So I've added in those specular indirects. So what we can see is now if I look at my full background layer with it added, I added in some backdrops just so everything is clear. So we can look at the beauty background and then the other one, you can see it's exactly the same thing. And before it looked like, let's go, sorry, I'm just changing the selection. Actually, there wasn't particularly much. That's good. It's good. I haven't adjusted the lights yet, but I just want to show you. Okay, so we have the same before. So there's not much indirect light there, and I did check the midground one. So in this instance, I didn't actually need to add it there. Where is it? Yeah, at the moment we can only see this tiny bit of floor, but it's not very shiny. The most noticeable bit was actually the foreground. So if I show you the beauty and the indirect, just ignore that thing, that's the background. But yeah, we can't really see any indirect in there, so it's fine. But when we take a look at the before and after with the foreground, as I've showed you before, there is a lot there. And another reason for that will be the fact that we added the surface shader, so it's actually adding a lot. Now the thing is, because we're overlaying it, as I said earlier, we won't have any control over it. So, you know, I wanted to set this up to make it, you know, as easy as possible to control lights. We're controlling the majority of it, but there will be a noticeable difference without the specular indirect. So if you want to fully control your renders, you'd have to combine the light AOVs from the specular direct into here as well. So you could do a similar setup. You could turn on all light groups for your specular indirects and then merge them together. So you see I've got the diffuse, I've got the specular over there. So what you'd do is you could create another backdrop. I guess if I was to do it here, I'd probably add in, like, copy and paste this backdrop, and then I could do A over B, again, the indirect on top of the specular, and then join in my exposures over there. So it would just be another round of things to add on. But for this example, I'm going to leave it. Like, I don't really need to do this. Like, I've set up these controls just so we can tweak the lighting, the majority of it. But once you've finished doing this and you finally get the lighting result you need, like, the purpose of this could be for if your shot's really heavy to render and you can only do a single frame, you might as well add on a few of AOVs and then spend a little bit of time setting this up rather than keep re-rendering, you know. So like when you work as a lighting TD, you might end up doing something like this because it's easier to adjust in comp, and then when it comes to the end of the day, then you can adjust your stuff. But for this particular project, we can do this now for the lighting, just to get a real you know, to get control over the majority of things that are going on in there. But then at the end of the day, you can just do a really simple comp. Like, it's always up to you. You can end up having comps more like this. As I said near the start of the video, this comp that I've got is actually the same thing, just recomped in different ways. So I've got this version here, and then there's more going on with the background. There's some cards in there, and then the most basic way, which is literally background over midground, add in the plate, add in the roto, foreground, whoops, you know, and you get a similar result. Like, if I read this, you know, we've got a CG in there. So if you're happy with doing that, you know, that's a basic way. But when we're looking at lighting, you know, it's worth, you know, because this didn't take very long to set up, even though I've been messing around with this for the last few days. So whenever I stop recording, there could be a few hours or another day in between the next edit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this recording and then alter my lights, and then I'll see where it's at, and then I'll go back into Maya and change the lights. As I'm adjusting these lights, the foreground that I do have the indirect specular on, I just figured I would show you the result, what happens. Because the specular broken out passes is still the majority of the contribution. So you see, as I increase my exposure on my HDR, you know, we still keep that color and we're still controlling it quite a lot, because we have, we are just, you know, this is overlaid, but it's overlaying on top of that. So it's adding a bit of color, but we're still controlling the majority of the lights from these other exposure controls. Okay, so I've made a few adjustments on the different render layers of the lights. On the left-hand side, for example, this room, I upped the HDR to get some. We're getting some spill from it, so I figured use it. I upped it by about 3 exposures. This light around here, I reduced by, I think it was just 1. The foreground, you can see it's been brought up a bit. This CG, so the plank, the sign, and the tankards. So I've brought them up a bit more. And what else? The background, I lowered the HDR, and I believe what I need to do is, now that I've actually made the adjustments in the exposures, what I could do now is I could just open up Notepad and just write down, okay, so it's going to be the same order for each of them, so we could just make a note of softbox 1, or we can just write it if you've got a pen and paper, just what exposures you've done, then we go and Maya and then make those adjustments. So they were my initial adjustments, and then working from that, then what I'm thinking is the lights will actually need to be changed in terms of their colors. We're getting a lot of orange up here, which is fine. That's more in keeping with the set. This is coming from the HDR. I like the shadow coming across here because we have the wall geometry in there, so that's fairly plausible. The lights hitting here are very bright, although we are getting some of the color information from the indirect specular, so that's good. But the light colors for the spotlights, at least, I think they need changing. This is coming out a bit blue, but that's actually from the gravel, because the light that's hitting there is actually white, so it's slightly distracting. What else? We want to add a bit more contrast on this right hand side. This barn is looking very flat, so I'm going to have to remove the light, actually change the positioning. I don't think it's actually giving us much. Like if I go back to my light controllers, which one was it? So it's softbox 3. So I still have it enabled, but the softbox 3 is the one at this side, the far right hand side, because I can see that this actress is being lit from the right hand side, so I added it in and it's not particularly doing too much. It's like lightening up the right hand side bit. Whoops, I'm actually controlling different layer, but we can see there it's just like flattening out that shadow. It's making the barn look really flat as well. I'd rather it was just darker there, so I did reduce the exposure, but I think, you know, in an example like that, it's probably best to get rid of that. So the things that need to change are, firstly, I guess, the exposures on the render layers that we've set. So you should probably make a note of the exposures that you've changed on the lights, and then what you can do is you can either add a specific render layer light change, or you could do it in the master layer. So I would advise doing things in the master layer initially. So up here, before doing it on separate render layers. But it depends. It depends, like if you're lighting for a sequence or not. So if you were lighting for a full sequence and you were doing a initial setup, then I would say you could do our setup that we were doing over here, where even though we've got the separate render layers, we were just combining the different lights, so we were affecting the whole shot. So if this was part of a sequence, I would probably do it this way. Well, I probably just render the master layer with the separate diffuse and specular renders, and then just combine them in this sort of way, just so we'd be controlling the lights for the entire shot rather than our separate layers. But this is a bespoke project, so it's fine doing it this way. So just showing you the result, I figured, so these are the notes that I got from just tweaking in Nuke. So there's a few changes there. So for example, background render layer lights, softbox 2, I was plussing 2 on the exposure. Spotlight 2, I was adding 1. You know, these changes, so I've made 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've made 9 changes, which, you know, if I was doing this in Maya, like per render layer, it might have taken longer to do. And if my renders are, you know, let's say you've rendered the entire sequence and it's like a few seconds long and it took like a very long time, you know, it's faster to change it in comp as well. So it depends how much time you've got as well. it can be very useful. So now I just need to transfer these across to Maya. And to change the lights per layer, I think I mentioned it earlier, but as a quick demonstration, if I go to Render Editor's Light Editor, so I'll just get on my notes on my other monitor. So I can see for the foreground layer which I'm on, I need to change softbox number 2. Where is that? Softbox shape 2. So I need to change the exposure of this by, where is it? -3. Okay, so I'll do create absolute override for layer, and then -3 from that, 16. Cool. What are the other changes? Softbox 3 needs to go down by -1. So I could do create absolute override, put it to -1. Spotlight 02. Where's that? Shape 2. That needs to go down by -2 as well. So create absolute override and go down by 2. So once we re-rendered this as well, because we've created an absolute override, it means we could just go onto this layer and change it, and we see that it's highlighted orange, which means it's just going to be affected for that layer. You can also see on the other lights that I've been editing, the E on them is orange as well. So that way we know we won't actually be affecting the scene. Because 2 of my other layers, I altered the HDR, this is worth mentioning. 2 of them I needed to up by 3, and then the foreground was just +1. In this instance, I'm actually going to go to the master layer and then change it there, which I've already done. So I just changed the exposure, but on my master layer, because I pretty much wanted the same effect on the other layers. I mean, it's gonna be a bit more expensive to render, but that's fine. I'm just gonna drop in right now and say that if you did want to do a similar process to what we've been doing in the video, but you don't want to have so many layers broken out, so these foreground, background, if you just want to, you know, have a basic scene to control your lights, turn on your master layer and then just turn on these diffuse, specular and specular indirect. And because we've already got the driver changed for diffuse and specular, it means we can render our entire scene and then control the lights in the same way that we were doing, but just rather than splitting them out into these groups, you know, we've got, because as we zoom out, that looks like there's a lot going on, but that's just the 3 render layers. So if you render from the master layer, you'll just be able to control your entire scene in a setup exactly like this. So it's up to you, really. There are multiple ways of doing these things, but I've broken it out into the separate layers just because it's a good example for the students I'm working with, and also it's probably a way that I would end up working. I would start, I would say, with the master layer version and then add in these at a later point, but because you know it takes time to record these videos, I've done it from the get-go, you know, add in the foreground, mid-layer, background, just so we can see how we would approach the lighting, adding the shader overrides, that sort of thing. So before I render again, I've changed the lights. I should just mention that if you re-render, you want to save your scene up. So, or if you want to overwrite your files, then you can just save as is, and then when you're in Nuke, you'll need to reload your files, I believe, unless it rereads them, updates. There's a reload section there, but hopefully it will just read through. Like, I'll find out in a minute anyway, so I'm just going to re-render this and see what it looks like. So what I'm going to do is adjust the scene a bit. I've done a few little alterations. These lights, these spotlights, I noticed they're giving off quite a lot of I mean, it's pure white they're giving off. Where is my render? Okay, so this is a bit deceiving because this is the master layer I rendered, so you notice there'll be a difference in color. Everything will look a lot lighter because on our master layer, the reflected objects, which you can actually see in here, are grey and they're being lit by the HDR. So all of that grey / white is being reflected, so it lifts everything up. But the whites that I had hitting here, I didn't particularly like. So what I've done for my lights, at least the spotlights, I think I did it on some other lights as well, is I changed the color that was giving off. But the color I chose was from the reference. Actually, we can see it down here. It's from my Macbeth chart, so I could pick from the highlight over there. I did actually color pick from my lights that I could see in the chrome ball, but it came to the same sort of value as my white in there. Because it is a light, we're essentially picking that color and then we're increasing the intensity of it anyway by altering the exposure. So I did that to add a bit more color back in to my renders, and I was just going to add another light for the fire. So this light, this little room in here, I could copy and paste that light. I just need to get inside of that room. Whoops. Okay, yeah, I won't duplicate a light, actually, I'll just create one. So I'm just gonna, I could pick a mesh light, but I'm just gonna keep area lights for the whole project. And let's bring that up, so it's pretty tiny. I'm just gonna change the shape to cylinder and pop this inside. As you can see, this is, the coal has holes in it, but we can't see that from the actual render. So that's fine, and that's good because we just want the light to emit from the holes. You know, if we added in atmospherics, then we could create some sort of, you know, God rays coming from it if we wanted to go crazy like that. So I'm just going to pick a random orangey shade. I'm sure that'll do. Exposure 15, don't know how that will look, I'll have to do a test render in a sec. Going to change the name of the light to fire_light. And add the name to, I'll just call it fire. Now that does mean we'll have to add it into our comp because it will come out as an extra AOV, but this light shouldn't be affecting any of the other renders really. Unless we do it really, really bright, it shouldn't be affecting the renders, the other render layers. What else was I going to do? I was going to adjust this light as well because it's pretty rubbish, to be honest. So I'm tempted just to move it for the barn and have a bit more, create a bit more shape to the barn area because we're just flattening the lighting for the barn area at the moment, at least. So if I bring a bit more fill to this side, you know, it's good to have some shadow there, but from our render, drive it up. Yeah. We were just flattening out. It's like taking a picture with a disposable camera. You just get the flash. So I'd rather this be darker and then the edges be picked out more on this side, but not too much, because you can see this actress, it's not as if she's that light from the front, but she's picked out the side. So we could try and do that same thing, but for the barn. This gate, I mean brick wall / gate, whatever. This has an interesting shadow across it, so I like that, that'll stay. That's fine. The room, I'm just going to keep it a bit dark, add in the firelight for a bit of intrigue, but it can't be that much, we don't want to affect this woman. So I'm going to do a couple test renders in Maya of these two lights, and if it looks fine, then I'm going to re-render everything and just put it in comp, and I'll I'll join you again when I'm in comp. So I have done a re-render of everything, but because I don't have scripts for Nuke, it means what I've done is I re-rendered, but I re-rendered over the same location because I know this is not going to be the final beauty. But what it does mean is that I have to reload each node. So this is the method you would do. You would, if you don't have any scripts, you can Google it. But for this tutorial, like, I haven't been using Nuke much recently, so I'm not going to bother searching for one. It just means I'm overwriting, so each of my renders I just have to double tap and then hit reload, and it will update my different bits. Because I applied the exposure settings as well, then I just need to reset my exposures as well before I take a look, because otherwise that's when it will get confusing. So once you've done your exposure changes in Nuke, you just need to go to, once you've re-rendered, maybe do this, save your script, and then reset your exposure nodes and then reload, whatever helps you. But aside from that, this is a really good way of controlling things. So this is essentially my second pass. You can see I've made a few alterations. I lowered the light that was affecting the barn, and then I moved my, I think it was softbox 3. Whatever light was there in the background, I just crept it round just so I can start breaking this up, add a bit more contrast, but not too intense, just light enough, similar to how this person's lit there, just a bit on the side. I would probably still bring that down in terms of exposure, but that's fine. This background as well is quite distracting. This area would have to be like removed or lowered, as well as the fact that I've just got a picture of Lord of the Rings in the background, whatever. What other aspects? I added a fire in the background. That's not too bad. I've just realised I didn't add it in. Because I've added this extra light, I would need to go back to, it's not affecting the other layers, so I need to go to, where is it, the midground, my mid room, and I would just need to add another one in here for the firelight, but then we'd be able to control that as well. Sorry, it should be, no, I do need to add it in, because it should look a bit more like that, but I don't think I did add it in. Okay, so what else do we need to look at? So the foreground, I altered the light colours a bit. Well, I changed the light colour for all the other parts. The tankards, I'm really liking, that's improved a lot. And I think this is embedding a bit better. We will have to create a shadow pass as well, but I've already done that in another video. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but if I remember to add it in, I'll just put it on top of what I'm saying now. So if I was to continue with this, I would probably do a paint over or something in Photoshop, just to get a better direction of where it's heading. Because I've done a first and kind of second pass. I reset my exposure nodes, so then I can go back and play with this a bit more. But we just need to look at how it's sitting in to the comp. So at this point in time, I would probably begin to do a paint over. I might do a quick one in a sec just as an illustration, but then I would add in, at least for the foreground layer, create a shadow pass, because it's kind of hard to see how it's sitting as well. But off the bat, I would say like that we need a bit more lighting on these wooden bits, these planks behind the actors. So we might have to put in, for the render, some objects vaguely in the position of the actors. The actors aren't moving that much. But depending on the scale of the production you're working on, you might just have to use a human rig of someone if you wanted really interactive shadows. But it's not strong lighting around there. The light is predominantly heading to the right, so it's directly hitting the baby. But you know, these are all the different things to consider. It's a bit blown out in the back as well though, so I might tweak the lights a bit and then show you what I've got, and then start to do a very quick paint over in Photoshop as well, because then we can take it from there and then look into where we'll head. But this integration here is pretty good, you know, because this is the raw CG. So then on top of that, you could do your grading, color correcting, and then we would need a proper background in there, rather than, you know, we'd have to remove some of this CG path and then put in a more better in keeping backgrounds, rather than just Google an image and put it in there. So I've actually just done a screenshot, but I played with it a bit. You can see on the right hand side I've dimmed down, created a bit more contrast for this barn, and I lowered the HDR for this background area. I think it doesn't help that this was textured and shaded like so fast, so we're getting really odd results like this. This is pretty much just pure specular, this gate. There's like nothing there to break it up. But this is purely just for an example, because I think I'm going to leave it here with this particular project. But yeah, I did raise the lights a bit on the, what is it, this, whoops, on the wooden fence, not fence, these wooden thingies, wooden planks. On the left hand side I've kept it quite dim, but you know, we can see a bit of light in there. There is a bit of intrigue. I would probably create a bit more of a shape in this side, you know, moving forward. So what I can do is I've created a new layer. If I wanted to, if you want to concept your shot a bit more, then you can just roughly paint over. I do have a tablet, but the pen pressure's not on, so it's not an amazing look. But let's say if we wanted to add, you know, a rim there, sort of highlight certain areas, we could just roughly paint, and then we can just blur it, go to filter and blur, and then I go to box blur, just crank this up, and then we could just fade it back, or we could erase it back. You know, we could do that sort of process, and then zoom out, and then check out what it's looking like. But I guess in this instance I wanted it to be more coming from the edge, so I'd probably just cut away a bit, you know, so it looks like the bricks are being highlighted a bit, that sort of thing. Very, very rough, just so we can get a better idea of where we're going with this sort of thing. And you can do the same for darkness as well. I should do a shadow layer for these, you know, the tankard and the other bits. But what I could do, if I really wanted an example of what it might look like, do the same thing, just paint that in. Because I think the shadows for this area will just end up looking a bit like that. Yeah, so this area on the right hand side, this would need to be highlighted a bit more. So we could change, like once we do, like paint it in and blur it, filter, blur, and then we could change the blend mode. Let's do soft light. I mean, this really extreme example of just painting that. But you could just play with your shot a bit, but what we've got to a point where we can actually play around with it. Like, we've got the bits in there, you know, we've done the slap comp, we can control the lights. So now we can just, I think it would help to actually add in other background elements, because just as a bit of a joke, I added in that Mordor shot. But it's quite distracting because it's not actually going to be part of our CG. I would probably also key the green screen, like even just add in a key light if you're not sure how to do that. Like in my comp area, you could just because you should green screen it properly later, but I'll just put in a key light node there and I'll just read from here. Click on the screen color, so I'll click on the black box, select the color green, and straight away it's already started removing the green, so when I go back to my render, this should remove some of the spill as well. Yeah, so we can, it's less distracting, so we actually have a better idea. Like now this looks like it's sitting in better. Like the lighting on this at the moment I think is fine, pretty much. We've got the nice fire there in there. It looks very plausible because you see how this CG is going to here. So it's working very well and we haven't even put that much effort into it. Areas that would need more work would be these foreground areas. We need probably need to put shadow pass in to integrate it better so we can see what's going on. These lights up here are too bright, so I would change I think this is spotlight 2, the one that's hitting this right hand side bit. I'd reduce that down. I would probably add in a separate light for these wooden boards there. At the moment they're not working so great. So because we do have a lot of light here, so we'd need more spill, and then I'd probably have to put in an object for these as a placeholder for these actors to just be shadowing. In terms of background CG, actually the tankards, I feel that they would need to be, this highlight here is too strong, so certain elements might have to be separated, like these foreground. So the foreground stuff is on a separate render layer, but this they could probably be broken down into their own separate layers. So although we've broken up these renders into like the mid, front and back render layers, you could probably once you've done the initial light tweaks, you could probably just render things separately. And you don't necessarily have to do all the breakdowns that we've just done in this example here, because it's just it is a lot of work to do that really, and it depends if you're using it or not. So in the background moving forward, I would say this light color needs to be changed. It's not, or well, I don't think, yeah, it's not really working, like the color. I like the contrast of it, so I'd probably darken this side and then move this softbox light around a bit more to shape this area, but then alter the color, bring it down a bit. This area could be probably a bit darker, but then maybe add a light in from the top, because we're getting a strong light on our gate, our brick wall. I'd lower the brick wall a bit more, because I'm looking at the reflections here on the shed, so I'd probably consider that. This shader as well is really distracting, so again, that's bad CG. So, because you can see there's nothing to it, it's literally like chrome or something. So that would need to be fixed. It's really distracting, and yeah, this wood's not very good as well. It's not very in keeping, so that's why it's hard to fully work with this project, because this was just a quick example. But hopefully after watching this tutorial, I know it's been long, but hopefully the timestamps would have helped. But this should get you from like 0 to something in terms of CG, you know, looking at a way of setting up lights so you can break them down for different render layers, or just add all your light groups to a master layer and just control your lights in a master layer, and then adding and altering lights from there. So I really do hope that helped.